The Standard Deviations podcast is a weekly production that looks at money, mind, and meaning, all through a psychological lens. Each week, psychologist and New York Times bestselling author Dr. Daniel Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest, experts in everything from finance to literature to wellness.
When was the last time you splurged on something when you knew it probably conflicted with one of your financial goals, like paying down debt or saving for future fun in retirement? Well, if you do this, you're not alone. It's because of present bias, or to use the psychobabble term, hyperbolic discounting. As humans, we have a tendency to let the immediate rewards of the here and now win out over a desired future reality. To learn more, check out the Cash Stash Dash, a planning tool brought to you by the Guardian Network to see just how much your short-term spends might be impacting your longer-term financial goals. Play today by visiting www.livingconfidently.com/play. Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and I am joined today in a Standard Deviations first by another shrink, FinTwit's own original Dr. Phil Pearlman, who is the Chief Community Officer at Stocktwits and the author of the Eight Fat Swine blog. Welcome to the show, Dr. Phil.
Dr. Crosby, it's fantastic to be here, my man. Thank you for having me.
And we're gonna drop the doctors from here on out, but we needed to get that out of the way. So I gotta start by telling a story on you, Phil. You were literally the very first person who was kind to me on financial Twitter when I was really just trying to break in, and I was just like trying to get my dumb little ideas out and trying to figure out this whole world. You and I connected. You were very kind and very generous to me. You invited me to Josh Brown's book signing for his first book, Backstage Wall Street, someplace in New York. I happened to be in New York at the time. You invited me to this party, and I found myself in the midst of every Long Island trader high-fiving and backslapping and catching up, and I huddled in a corner and I knew no one, and I stayed for like 10 minutes and I bailed. But it was super nice of you to invite me. So thank you for being the first person to reach out to me here on FinTwit.
Dude, that's so awesome. I mean, that's going back a ways, and I'm so glad you came. You know,
Yeah.
It's just, you turned up. Like, what do they say? You know, showing up is like 80%.
Yeah, I showed up and like sipped a cranberry juice in the corner and looked like the scared country mouse that I was and am. But here we are talking on the podcast today. So listeners will know all about my route from being a clinical psychologist to a stock market guy. But let's hear yours. How did you make it from the world of clinical psych into the place you find yourself at now? And then we'll talk about how you're introducing sort of full circle some clinical ideas into your work.
Well, I tell you, I had a Daytech account very early on. And for those who are not aware, Daytech was a very early electronic broker. They got bought, and then they got bought. Whoever bought them got bought. But they were back, this goes back into the 90s. And I had gotten an award. My first job out of school was a teacher. I got an award for being a good teacher. I put it in a Daytech account, and I started trading. And ironically, I was a total noise trader. I was just like, oh my God, market's going crazy. You know, I had like 30 grand in there, and I grew it from there. And then I went into, professionally, I was in grad school, clinical, and as you know, clinical psychologists, while they're studying, one of the last, they have to do a dissertation and they have to do an internship. It's a big deal. It's a one-year internship. A lot of people travel to do it. I went up to Rochester, and I was at a day treatment center, and I had a supervisor who was a Rorschach guy. Exner system, that whole thing, and he was really into bipolar disorder, and we were working with a tough group of adolescents, and some of them were diagnosed, they were out of control, and some of them had sort of the manic depressive constellation, and so I was deep into that. And meanwhile, this was literally started in September 99. That's when I went on internship. So it was 20 years ago. And that was right as the bubble was bursting. And I got there and I was studying mania, working with kids who were wild. And I remember seeing Bezos on the cover of Time magazine and just going, oh my God, this whole thing is a freaking mania, man. I'm right in the middle of it with my Daytech account and trading Yahoo, getting added to the S&P 500 and Cisco Disco and AOL. And I freaked out and got really bearish and started right there. That was the beginning. That was the genesis of me looking at behavioral economics, which is really an integration of two social sciences, right? It's the integration of psychology, social psychology, not clinical psychology, and economics. And I started going down that road right into 2000. And, you know, the NASDAQ topped in March of 2000. And by then, I was reading about bubbles and all of the manias. And so I was deep in it. I had gotten super bearish early, which helped me and hurt me. It helped me because it hurt me because I sold everything too soon. It helped me because I sold everything. It hurt me because I sold everything a little bit too soon. But by then I was hooked. So then I really started getting into, you know, Richard Thaler and Kahneman and Tversky and that whole canon of the behavioral literature, which by the way, is a very young science. So, the heuristics article published in Nature, what was that, 74. So, it's a science, 26, 36, 45 years. Behavioral economics is really only a 45-year-old science. And even that is early, even 74. And then prospect theory was published in 79. Even that was before anybody was really calling it behavioral economics.
So you correctly stated that behavioral economics is sort of the integration of economics and social psychology, but you had your epiphany about market manias when studying, when sort of living with individual manias in a clinical setting. So is there a place for clinical psychology and behavioral finance? And I would lead with the caveat that I was featured in a news article recently, and I can't remember where, but it said, this clinical psychologist says, do X, Y, Z in the market. And it was referring to me. And I made the cardinal sin of being on the internet, which was to read the comments. And there were a number of people saying, why would you listen to a clinical psychologist about the stock market? So respond to those people in the comments. Do people like you and I have any business like applying clinical insights into capital markets?
Well, here's the thing there. We are getting right to the heart of where I'm coming from early on in this conversation. And that is this, that social psychologists have been amazing at defining, observing, adding methodology, scientific methodology to social and behavioral phenomena. People tend to behave this way in these types of situations. That's fantastic. Great, lovely. However, it really has been the clinical psychologists who have developed broad theories of personality, the way that a full person fits together across multiple modes of experience, from behavior to emotions, to the way we think, to the instinct, to the way that environment and family affects, to the way that support systems affect our global functioning, and the way that those pieces all fit together. That's personality theory, right? And so the social psychologists never really got to a theory of personality. I mean, Bandura and social learning theory, but even that is a very linear, a very sort of two-dimensional or brief model. But the clinical psychologists were looking at personality very, very early on, since before it was called clinical psychology. And Freud certainly had a theory of personality, a drive theory, and ego, superego, and id, all of that stuff. And then the guys that came along after him have these fuller models of personality. And so those models are super critical in understanding more globally the way we behave. And in addition to that, one thing that behavioral economics has really gotten to the heart of is that we're not rational actors in markets, right? None of us are homo economists. It's a figment, right? It's a prototype, not a reality. It's normative. And because of that, because behavioral economics has gotten to the description aspect, it's gotten to, well, this is how people really behave. And guess what? The way they really behave is pretty irrational. We're loss averse, we get anxious, we get overly confident, all these things. We avoid loss realization, to use Kahneman and Tversky's term. Because of that, we need prescription. We need to have ways to behave less irrational if we want to improve ourselves. If we're market participants, even if we're passive, even if we're just saving for our retirement and dollar cost averaging, market psychology is going to affect us, especially during bear markets and especially during periods of losses. So the other thing that clinical psychology has, besides having broad personality theories, is it also has processes of change. It also has prescriptive models, and especially within the last, 40 to 50 years, it has prescriptive models that have been tested and retested and refined over time. And that's where, for me, it really, really gets interesting. And also that, for me, is why I'm very interested in sort of everything from the broad theoretical development of behavioral economics to the very narrow sort of applied prescriptive potential of behavioral economics.
So I want to talk a lot more about your theory in just a moment. I think you're doing some of the most exciting research out there on sort of a unified theory of investor experience. But before we leave your clinical experience, I want to talk, you had your epiphany when sort of noticing analogous things between markets and the individuals with mania with whom you were working. Are there salient differences, though, between mental illness and irrational market behavior? If there are some similarities, are there also some differences that are worth talking about?
There's two things that really are critical, and one is a difference. And the big difference is mental illness can be very severe. And part of it, by definition, is debilitation in adaptive functioning. And what I mean by that is that people with real mental illness have difficulty functioning. So a mental illness, whether it's depression or anxiety or substance abuse or anything, it affects your functioning. So if you're a person with potential X, you might be functioning at X minus Y potential. You're not living up to your potential. And as a matter of fact, not just not living up to your potential, but it's debilitating you. It's preventing you in some way to function and to live a quote unquote normal life. Market participant, irrational market participant behavior is not that, okay? You do stupid things with money, especially within the domain of losses. You have a tendency to maybe get more you maybe sell at the bottom, or maybe get more risk seeking while you're losing, going on tilt or doubling down. You do all kinds of dumb things, but it's not, and in some cases it could be debilitating if you lose everything, I suppose. But for the most part, your adaptive functioning, your global adaptive functioning is not horribly affected. That's the big difference, and it's a crucial big difference, because loss aversion is not major depression. It's not that severe. Okay. The other really interesting thing, the other big difference is that mental illness is abnormal, right? The average person is not debilitated by depression or anxiety. They experience it, but it's subclinical, right? They experience, some people have some anxiety, but it doesn't prevent them from going over a bridge. Maybe they drink a little bit too much, but they don't lose their family and their house and their job because they can never put the bottle down. That's subclinical, right? Having a real bona fide mental illness where you're debilitated is abnormal. And I mean that in terms of a normal curve. It's a small percentage of the population that has any one mental illness bona fide. On the other hand, prospect theory, disposition effect was so named because Scheffer and Statman, they thought of it as a disposition. It's normal. Prospect theory is normal, right? Loss aversion is normal. So irrational market participant behavior is normal, and mental illness is abnormal. And to me, that's a really interesting and important difference. And it has, I think, prescriptive implications as well.
So I'm absolutely 100% with you on the second point. As a point of clarification on the first point, I conceive of mental illness as existing sort of along a continuum. Like you said, everybody gets sad. Not everybody gets so sad that they can't eat, or that they can't go to their job, or that, that they can't get out of bed in the morning. And when it passes, when it begins to affect your ability to move through the world in a meaningful way, that's when it goes from being subclinical to clinical. So likewise, though, couldn't we say that, yes, the average market participant is loss averse, maybe they hedge their bets a little bit too much, but is there a group of people that exhibits sort of clinical level bad investor behavior to the point that they're so compelled to make poor choices that they can't save for retirement, that they can't pay their bills because they're so addicted perhaps to overtrading or to being mixed up in day trading or other sort of maladaptive behaviors? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm just thinking out loud. Is there a place where it crosses a line into being, quote unquote, clinical because it's impacting your ability to thrive and to meet your goals?
100% that is the case. And my strong hunch there, this is a whole other avenue, I think, of very interesting research at the nexus of clinical psychology and behavioral economics. And that is diagnostics. And my strong hunch there is that where you have people who are so affected by loss aversion and sort of the components of that, the anxiety associated with that, in my opinion, it's strongly related to anxiety, that you are going to see comorbidity. In other words, where you have people that are so affected by loss aversion that they're just doing things that are so stupid with their money or so irrational with their money, there's going to be other illnesses, mental illnesses there. There's going to be severe anxiety, whether it's sort of a generalized anxiety or whether it's a more specific anxiety, or there's going to be some other affective disorder, clinical level affective component there. That's my opinion. I have no, proof of that, but my guess is, and you see that. You see people that are depressed or people that have an anxiety disorder that have all kinds of symptoms that look like all kinds of different things. You look at it, they're abusing drugs to medicate themselves, or they're doing something, they can't sleep. And so it's a sleep disorder too. So there's all of those types of constellations. So my strong hunch is that in people where loss aversion is so pronounced that it affects their lives in a really significant, prolonged manner, that there's probably some other sort of more formal mental health issue, clinical level mental health issue occurring.
Yes. So Phil, now I want to get to sort of the crown jewel of this conversation. When I saw you at the Wealth Stack conference and we had a little bit of a chance to catch up, I asked you what you were working on, and you told me in brief terms about your cognitive theory of noise, which is your stab at a comprehensive theory of investor experience. So I can tell you candidly, I've not been that excited about a development in behavioral finance in a very long time, because I think it's much needed, but it's enormously ambitious, right? I mean, it's enormously ambitious. So I'd like to hear from you why you think we need this, why you think the discipline needs this, and then beyond that, what makes you think that it's possible to describe something as varied and dynamic as investor experience?
Well, this is something I've been thinking about for a long time. And there was a period where I began developing it a few years ago, a while ago, that I thought I was being ridiculous because, who was I to develop such a ambitious model? And over time, as I really didn't do much with it, I sketched a few things up here and there. It became much more obvious to me. As I learned more, as I continued reading, and as I sort of learned more about the world, that this was not only nobody had really begun. It was so obvious to me, I figured somebody's going to have to be working on this. But as I mentioned earlier, behavioral economics is a very young science. You could say maybe it's 40 years old. You could go back further, but prospect theory was published in 1979. So let's sort of use that as a flag in the ground. Very young science. And on the psychology side, social psychology, many of the phenomena have been well researched, described, and articulated. So I'm talking about everything from sort of the really major ones like overconfidence, like loss aversion. They've been well described, but they have not really been integrated, right? I mean, people talk about these are cognitive social models. People talk about these are normal, universal. But there's really no underlying fit into a personality. So coming at this as a clinician, as a clinical psychologist, I'm saying to myself, well, where's the model? Where do these fit into? As a matter of fact, about 15 years ago, this is very funny. So if you look at heuristics, right, you have all these different heuristics. So the heuristics all have these different names, and they're all sort of thought of as separate phenomena. And over the years, they've been watered down. Every time the market goes down a lot, there's an article in one of the major papers about the heuristics, and here's why we do all these dumb things that we do. And it's sort of been repeated over and over and over again. But you go back to the original paper, and it's coming from one paper, right? It's coming from one article where, Kahneman and Tversky sat down and sort of began to describe these things. And, 30 years later, something popped up called the affect heuristic, right? And so the affect heuristic, I don't think it really ever went anywhere. And I think it was Paul Slovic I hope I'm not getting this wrong. It's been a while, but it was like 2005. Paul Slovic out in Oregon started talking about and brilliant genius guy. And he's talking about the affect heuristic, how affect affects our market behaviors, right? How we shortcut based on our emotion. And think about how disconnected that is from the full person. It's like sort of pulling out affect as if it was one thing and saying this one thing affects, right? And so all of these heuristics and all of these phenomena and all of these observations and all of these descriptions really are only talking about a human, right? These are all things that go on inside of a human. And so clinical psychology says, hey, we have these theories of the way humans work. And so there was a movement. And so what happens also is that we get, and this is just an organizational truth, right? You have these large systems. And what tends to happen in large systems is they tend to be siloed. So when you have this one vein of psychology or one field called social psychology, all the social psychologists are looking at each other, they're reading each other, and they get siloed into the research that is social psychology. And then the clinical psychologists do the same exact thing. And there's some crossover. I mean, I remember there's a book called, or social psychology issues in clinical psychology or something like that. But it's like it's one book, it's one book with 3 chapters about Bandura, right? So it's really not this whole thing. So what I'm saying is that, listen, let's take a personality model that is a robust, rich, descriptive plus prescriptive model, and let's begin to graph or integrate. I mean, on my worst days, I think it's a graph or an assimilative integration. And at my best days, I think it's really an integration at the theoretical level from the top to the bottom. Let's take a really robust model of personality, personality theory, and let's begin to try to place all of these phenomena within that model and see if it fits. And it turns out that not only is there just a perfect model for this case, but that what I've looked at so far, and I've really only looked at disposition effect, which is a big one. I mean, disposition effect covers the way that people behave within the domain of losses and the way that people behave irrationally within the domain of gains. It's really an extension, one of the most direct extensions of prospect theory. Let's take those phenomena and see if we can integrate those within the context of the cognitive therapy theoretical model. And the cognitive therapy theoretical model is really a cognitive behavioral model that was founded by Aaron Beck, who is one of the great, if not the great, psychological minds of the 20th century. He built a model that was really very simple. He began his career. He's still with us, by the way. I think he's 99 years old. He's a professor emeritus at Pennsylvania. I think it's an honorary title now. But this man, he was a Freudian. He was an analyst early in his day. And he was looking at depression. And he was being influenced by the same exact philosophical changes as Kahneman and Tversky were being influenced by. So the cognitive revolution was happening, right? We were getting more scientific about the way we were able to look at, observe, and test the way we think and feel and behave in the world. And, the 50s and the 60s were marked by this cognitive revolution in the areas of all areas of psychology: perceptual psychology, clinical psychology, social psychology. And Kahneman and Tversky are social cognitivists. And Beck, Beck was an analyst, but he needed ways to test his views. And also he was more active with his clients, something that the strict Freudians were very passive. They would just sit, tell me about you. I'm oversimplifying, but tell me about your mother and then listen and really not show your cards. He was more active and more human. And he began to develop a really simple, elegant model, a triadic model. And, a triadic model is just basically a triangular model. It has roots going back to Plato, Platonic triangular models. And he basically said that, the way that we think affects everything else. And that the interaction between the way that we think, the way that we feel, and the way that we behave, those three components, that triangle of components, interact in a sophisticated, complex, somewhat predictable manner. And he started to look, he was working with depressives, and he said, I can draw a profile, a constellation of depressive types based on the way they think. They tend to think negatively. The way they behave, they tend to be risk averse. Sound familiar? And they tend to feel, obviously, they feel depressed. I'm oversimplifying for the sake. And then he went on to really, in just a impeccable impeccable empirical basis, he began to prove this out. And there's, all kinds of Beck inventories and questionnaires and tests that have been validated, revalidated, revised over time. And he built a constellation. And that, by the way, was published. His first big work, Cognitive Therapy for Depression, I think it was called, was published in '79, the same year the Prospect Theory was published. So the parallels, so here are these two monster geniuses, Kahneman and Tversky in the area of this judgment and decision-making, which is a component of social psychology, and Aaron Beck, who was a giant in clinical psychology, really moving along this parallel course, parallel but separate. One in clinical realm, one in social psychology and the decision-making realm, both coming out of the cognitive revolution, and both incredibly, super elegant in their evidence basis and empirical development, and siloed, never talked to each other, never, no overlap. They never got together for a beer, not that I know of. And the models, these theories, and really these whole fields of psychology sort of evolved in a parallel without ever touching. And so the obvious thing for me, which I only realized over the last 5 or 7 years was not obvious to everybody else, was that you can take, so what happened with cognitive therapy is really, really fascinating. Experts in different areas of clinical psychology, not just depression, began to see the work Beck was doing, study under him, study under the people that studied under him, and began developing cognitive therapy models and these triangle profiles for everything under the sun, right? So it wasn't just depression anymore. It became cognitive therapy for anxiety. Here's the triangle profile. Cognitive therapy for personality disorders. Here's each personality disorder, and here's the way that these triangle profiles look for, avoidant personality or narcissistic personality. And alcohol, cognitive therapy. So the basic model, this basic triangle model, and the basic theory behind it, that the way we think, the way it affects the way we feel and behave, and that there's this complex, somewhat predictable interaction of the way those three interact, given specific clinical constellations or diagnoses, was generalizable across disorders. So all I'm really saying now is, hey, let's take something that has never been looked at historically as a clinical or an abnormal psychological phenomena, which is just irrational. It's normal, so people wouldn't think to look at it this way. Let's take that constellation and do the exact same thing. So, okay, let's think about that then. So the perfect place to start is disposition effect. So quick review of that. Disposition effect, these guys came along after Prospect Theory was published, and they said, okay, people are loss averse. People dislike taking losses, which is loss realization avoidance. And then within the domain of gains, they have a tendency to sell the winners too soon. So they're irrational in both domains. If you're losing, they tend to hold and get more risk-seeking, where the rational actor would sell and get more risk-averse. And within the domains of gains, when you should be holding, you have a tendency, this natural tendency, this prospect theoretic tendency or disposition to sell and take your gains and do the happy dance. And so all disposition effect said is this can be applied to markets, not just, simple prospects, which is the way the Kahneman Tversky kind of proved it out. And lo and behold, it's so obvious. Anybody who's been a market participant has been through this. There have been many studies. It's incredibly robust, and researchers have come along and tested it and tested for other things. Well, maybe this is just a tax avoidance strategy and it's wholly rational, or maybe it's something else. No, it's not. It's loss aversion. It's loss realization avoidance. And so all I'm saying is, okay, well, let's take the profile now. So now let's do a triangle profile on the disposition effect rider. And here's a really funny thing. In the original paper, they used the term get-evenitis. It's a cutesy term, get-evenitis, right? And so what that's doing, though, the thing I always loved about that is that it is tipping a hat. An itis is a disease, right? When you have something that's an itis, it's saying, oh, this is a sickness. So they are sort of almost in a joking way tipping the hat to this is a condition. This is not just an irrationality, but it's a disease or a clinical condition. And so let's talk about the triangle profile. Now we're going to do the integrative work. Let's talk about the triangle profile of a disposition rider or somebody suffering get-evenitis. I get into a trade, I'm losing money, or I'm contributing to my 401k, I reach a certain level, and all of a sudden there's a bear market. The global financial crisis hits, or the NASDAQ bubble pops, the internet bubble pops, or whatever. Periodically, there's going to be booms and busts. That's the nature. As long as humans are involved with markets. That's a whole other conversation, by the way, the collective. If you take all of these irrational behaviors and you put them together, that's what makes markets irrational. But that's a whole other conversation for another day. So we're going to look at this get-evenitis guy. I get in the market, I get into a trade, or whether I'm getting into a trade or I'm investing, for my retirement, and either I'm losing in the trade or it's a bear market, whatever. What are the triangle components? Okay. So the behavior is the easiest one. And as you know well, behavior is the most observable out of all of these, right? Emotion and cognition are internal phenomena, much harder to measure, but behavior is very easy to measure. And so, and market behavior is super easy to measure, right? You only have three behaviors. You have buy, hold, and sell. And so the behavior is I buy, I'm in a losing trade, and instead of selling, I hold or I double down. That is the behavior. Very, very simple. Go ahead.
Yeah, so let me jump in here. I want to try and make this as concrete as possible for people who are not super familiar with cognitive therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. I think the easiest way to think about it and how I used to teach my clients about it was in this ABC framework, right? The A being the activating event, which is of course out of our control. The B being the belief, and the C being sort of the consequence or what results from that. So, I use an example with my kids because it's top of mind, right? So maybe little brother is being annoying is the activating event. The belief of big sister is, my little brother is an annoying jerk. And so the consequence is they fight or, they argue. So where do you intervene in this whole thing? Well, the activating event in many cases is out of our control. Like as we move through life, like bad stuff's going to happen, markets are going to crash, people will die, markets will crash, bad things will happen, accidents will happen. Can't always intervene with the activating belief, the activating event. The belief is where we can work some magic and it'll lead to a new consequence. So can you give sort of a concrete example using this ABC model of, what might be a market activating event? What might be an errant belief? What might be a misguided belief that leads to a bad consequence or a bad outcome? And then sort of a related question is, what hope does rational thinking have in the face of something visceral, like watching your portfolio just bleed?
Well, you just asked amazing gargantuan question, and I'm tipping my hat to Mr. Albert Ellis, who, as I'm sure you're aware, is sort of the father of the ABC model, and also, if there were co-fathers of cognitive behavioral therapy, it would have been Beck, and it was Beck and Ellis, right? And so you're coming at the same school from a bit of a different angle, but I'm going to answer your question. The belief is critical because then you're getting to the cognitive component. So the way that Beck would break that down is you have these core beliefs, right? People have these things that they think about themselves, okay? And they develop very early. They're often passed down from their parents, and they are firmly ensconced in the human, the schema. They're fully ensconced in the way that we think about ourselves. A lot of times they're very unconscious and we're not aware that we even think that way about ourselves or about the world. And they're very broad statements, So a core belief may be, I'm not safe in the world. I have to protect what I have. A core belief could be, people think that I'm better than I am. Why do you get, why do so many people get imposter complex when you get a new job? It's a very common phenomenon. It's not a mental illness. It's just a common phenomenon because a lot of people have these similar types of core beliefs, right? So these are the types of core beliefs that normal people have. They're not something that are completely abnormal, but they aren't necessarily 100% true, right? It could be something like losers are terrible, right? It might not even be about them. Losers are pathetic. Or it could be something like it's really unacceptable to lose money. You might not be aware that you feel that way, but you do, right? And you might feel that way for good reason because it's not a great thing to lose money. It really is terrible, right? So it might not even be that irrational. So where does that go? Well, then what happens is these core beliefs get triggered by activating events, to use your ABC model, right? So, okay, I have this core belief that is somewhere deep in my psyche that losers are losers and it's unacceptable to lose money, especially. And then what happens? Boom, I lose money. I get into a trade or I'm saving for retirement, the global financial crisis hits, and all of a sudden, the money I've been saving for a long time has, diminished very significantly. It doesn't even necessarily have to be under my basis point, under my cost basis, but it goes from being at X to, X minus 40% of X or whatever. That triggers these types of thinking. Losing this money will be devastating to me. Things have to get better. Things just have to get better. I'm hoping they just have to get better. This is a classic. It's not a loss until I sell, right? That's like this classic one, right? Or a little bit more of a subtle one, but I think you'll get this. How about if I just don't think about it at all? How about if I just go have a beer? How about if I just go have a drink? Or how about if I just, do something else that I like to do? I go on an expensive vacation. Do anything to avoid it cognitively. I'm not going to think about it. So these are ways that we react. These are things that our responses, these automatic responses, right?
So once someone becomes aware of one of these automatic responses, and you're right, they're not clinical in the strictest terms, but they are maladaptive, right? They're not leading us to the outcome that we want. So let's say we become aware of this, I have to sell at X, at X percentage, or I hate losers, or whatever the maladaptive thinking pattern is. What can they do to sort of challenge this thinking and bring about a better outcome?
Well, that's a great question. And this is another, before you were asking me, why even do this? Why even subject yourself to such a tall order here? Who cares? And the beautiful thing about the cognitive therapy model is that there's interventions that have been tested over and over again within the clinical realm that can be adapted to irrational market behaviors. And so, for example, one beginning, and you alluded to this earlier, becoming aware, you said, right? You used the term becoming aware. So consciousness raising, or making somebody aware of what's happening, testing the thinking, that is a first step. That is an early part of any cognitive therapy approach, is to begin to probe into these automatic thoughts and into these core beliefs and into some of this maladaptive information processing, and begin to test it and begin to examine it. Hey, okay, let's see. Or is it really true that if I lose some money here, my life is over? Or I'm a loser. I'm pathetic. Am I really pathetic? And you test that, right? You have to begin testing that. So the first thing is to raise awareness. And then the second thing is to begin to test it. And that is really the heart. As a matter of fact, the cognitive behavioral models are Socratic models at heart. They really are, hey, we're going to begin to test this way that you look at the world. Ellis did it in a way that was more blunt, as I know you're aware, and Beck did it in a way that was humanistic, but a little bit more sort of scientific, if you will. So that would be a first step. And then there's all types of additional interventions that become even more active, and those would be behavioral interventions. And so from my point of view, I model the disposition effect sort of within the realm of an anxiety disorder. And the reason that I do that is because if you think about the words going back to 79 that Kahneman and Tversky used, they use the words aversion and they use the word avoidance. Loss realization avoidance, which is such a great term, right? And so avoidance, well, what's avoidance? Avoidance is a classic symptom of anxiety, right? Take a simple phobia, right? You're scared of heights, You're scared of going over a bridge. You're scared of flying. So what do? What is the maladaptive behavioral response? You don't fly. You don't go over bridges. You avoid. So if loss realization avoidance or the disposition effect or get evenitis is an anxiety constellation, within the anxiety constellation of avoidance and aversion, then the behavioral treatments will be similar to the way that we treat simple phobias and the way that we treat often anxiety, avoidance anxieties, and that is through exposure. And so some of I know I'm sort of speaking up to this audience, and I'm not going to stop that because it's like, let's talk about this. But I will explain a little bit about what exposure is because it is very specific. Graded exposure is the idea that the way that you help somebody get over a kind of a specific anxiety is that you gradually expose them to that stimulus of the anxiety, whether it's a plane or whether it's a bridge or whether it's a tall building or whether it's a spider or whatever. You expose the person to that in a very graded manner. You don't start, you don't put them, you don't tie them up in a car and drive them over a bridge. The first thing you do is maybe just have a conversation in your office about a bridge, right? You could see their, depending on how phobic they might be, you can see certain signs of anxiety change, even just mentioning the word bridge. And somebody who's really bridge phobic, their heart may increase. The heartbeat rate may increase. Their body temperature, skin temperature may increase. They may breathe. More rapidly. Those are arousal signals. So you talk about it, and then you use guided relaxation. You help them breathe, certain types of muscle relaxation, talking about a bridge until they relax. After a while, you sit there talking about a bridge. It sounds dumb, but you sit there talking about a bridge for 20 minutes. You're not going to necessarily stay at that elevated anxiety rate after 20 minutes. You're sort of going to get anxious, have a little panic, and then you're going to, panics don't last forever, right? Panics are by definition short-term phenomena. So you're not going to die from talking about a bridge, and then your heart's going to sort of slow down a little bit. That's phase one. The next phase, maybe you look at a picture of a bridge. You do the exact same thing. The next may be you close your eyes and have somebody, or listen to a tape or have somebody walk you through really vividly imagining a bridge. You're going to have that experience and then calm down. And you keep taking progressive steps until you approach the bridge and go over the bridge. And then you keep doing that until you don't experience this type of anxiety. And then there's a cognitive component to that too. Hey, did you die? Hey, did the bridge collapse? Well, let's try it again and see if it collapses this time. And all of a sudden, you are becoming your own scientist and you're collecting evidence. Hey, you lost this money. Are you really pathetic? That's sort of the corollary there. So in going back to the disposition effect within the domain of losses, the thing to do would be to talk about the loss and just bring it to the top. That in and of itself could create some anxiety, especially to somebody who's gone through that experience and becomes incredibly trigger, edgy, or has a trip finger, right? Go ahead.
I love that your cognitive theory of noise is embedded within sort of this larger framework of cognitive theory and cognitive therapy, because I think probably the biggest complaint that I hear from folks when I'm out in the world writing books and doing book signings and speaking and things is sort of like, so what? It's like, okay, I love behavioral finance. It's cool to learn about these quirks of human behavior, but it's nice to tap into a theory that has a so what to it and has sort of some prescriptive interventions. So last question here before this turns into a Joe Rogan length podcast is psychology has historically been good at creating sort of descriptive theories, right? If you come to a shrink with a constellation of symptoms, I'm not experiencing pleasure, I'm sad, I'm not eating, go, okay, well that's what we call depression. I can describe that. And we've even had some success with prescription or proscription, right? To say, and this is what you can do to feel better. I think where psychology and behavioral science more broadly sort of falls on its face is in prediction. Do you sense that we will ever get, with a cohesive theory of investor experience, to a place where we can make forward-looking statements about both people and markets based on this kind of cohesive theory?
No, I don't. I think we can improve. But here's the thing: as long as humans are involved with markets, there's going to be irrational behavior, and we may be able to improve. But let's say we take functioning from one. Let's say we put functioning on market behavior on a functioning continuum from 1 to 10. With 1 being somebody who just always sells at the bottom and buys at the top, and 10 being somebody who behaves perfectly rational within markets. You can move somebody from a 1 to a 3, or from a 4 to a 7, or maybe an 8 if they're really a good student. But you can't move people. It's very difficult to move people from a 1 to a 10. And that is because people bring with them tools, different levels of tools. Some people come and they're very intelligent and they're very much able to understand, and they come to you with a high level of capacity for self-awareness. But you might also get somebody who comes to you with zero capacity for self-awareness, and they might be ridiculous in the way they behave, and you might be able to move them along the continuum a little bit. But if they're at a 2, you're not going to get them to a 9. You might get them to a 4 or a 5, or maybe a 6 if they're really dedicated. So it's an imperfect thing. And the one other thing that I would say about that is, and I'll leave you with this as a good ending. The way that it is now is like this. We understand in a sort of siloed way what the phenomenon looks like. We have a good capacity to describe. Behavioral economics has been wonderful descriptively. But if I could describe depression, and let's say you came to me and I was a therapist, and you came to me and you were severely depressed, and I sat with you and I gave you some tests, and I gave you a diagnostic assessment, and I came to the conclusion strong with a high level of certainty that you were severely depressed. That would be, and then I said to you, Daniel, you're depressed. Stop being depressed. Snap out of it. That's where we are right now. That's sort of the extent of our ability. We have this great descriptive ability. Now we have to get on with getting more sophisticated about processes of change and about evidence-based prescription.
Okay, that is absolutely brilliant. I will steal that again and again with attribution, like a good doctor. But I think that's exactly right. We are at a place where we go, here's what's wrong with you, cut it out, and it's not helpful for anyone. And in fact, anyone who's studied human behavior knows that there can actually be sort of a backfire effect from telling people to snap out of it or to just be happy. It can actually make things worse. And I think that's where we are in some respects with behavioral finance. So just as to sort of put a bow on this model piece of it, and we'll end with sort of a fun free association piece. It wouldn't be talking to a shrink or two shrinks in this case without a little free association. But I will say that the 2 greatest philosophers of all time, and I'm not going to have this debate with anyone, the 2 greatest philosophers of all time are Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And those 2 philosophers, neither one of them ever had a formal academic post. They were just students of behavior, they were students of the mind, and they were out there living life. And so I am excited. I think the biggest advances in behavioral finance in the years to come will build on the foundation made by great academic minds like Thaler and Kahneman and Tversky and lots of the folks you mentioned today. But I think that some of the next steps that we take in behavioral finance towards an applied science, towards a prescriptive science, I think they're going to come from folks like Phil. So I am eagerly watching the Eight Fat Swine blog for updates as he continues to hone and focus his thinking around this theory. I think it's one of the most important pieces of work being done right now, and I'm excited to watch it. So we're going to end with a little free association. You know how this works. You're a doc. I'm going to throw out a word or a phrase to you, and you just tell me the first thing that comes to your mind.
Go.
You in? Greatest jazz album for people who know nothing about jazz.
Oh my God. Well, I hate it. I hate going with the trend. I hate going with the herd, but Kind of Blue is Miles Davis Kind of Blue. Put that on a Friday night with your significant other, open a bottle of wine and make some good pasta. That'll get you interested in jazz.
There you go. There, markets tell us lots, right? So it's famous for a reason. Okay, next one. What is an underappreciated or slept on behavioral finance classic book?
There's a book called The Richest Man in Babylon. It's a personal finance book, but it's also a psychology book. It's so simple. Basically, it's wrapped in parables, but the basic idea is put away 10% of everything you ever make. It's brilliant, and I never hear anybody talk about it. It's probably 70 pages long, if that.
So my dad is still a financial advisor, and when I was a kid, I remember going to visit him at his office, which was filled with smoke.
That's classic.
Yeah, it being the 80s in Alabama. So going to visit him at his office that was just completely filled with smoke. And he had sort of a little pamphletized version of The Richest Man in Babylon that he gave to every single one of his clients and prospects. So it's an absolutely fantastic book that I've been, reading since I was a kid, and it's a really great one. And then,
I love that you know that. I love it.
Yeah. And then the last one, the greatest value investment in life.
Oh, you've been reading my blog.
I have been reading your blog.
I will tell you this, we are born with one body, and that's all we ever get. And there's people out there who are saving money, and they're going to retire. But if they're not taking care of their body, then when they get to that age, they're going to have nothing left to have fun with. You get one vessel, you get one body, take care of it. So to me, health and investing in your health, taking care of yourself, getting sleep, looking and learning about how to eat, moving your body every single day, that's the greatest value. And it's so undervalued. I mean, we're walking around in a country where obesity is increasing. I would say that's the greatest value investment and super undervalued in this specific culture.
I absolutely agree. So Phil, absolutely a joy having you today. If people want to connect with you, if they want to read your work and follow the development of this theory, where can folks connect with you?
If you hit me on Twitter, I will reply. At P Pearlman, at PPEARLMAN. You can hit me there. Probably the easiest place. I may, if it's the weekend, I won't get back to you, but by Tuesday I will.
You know what? And folks, if you're very lucky, he may invite you to a book signing party where you can hide awkwardly in the corner. So I will bring it full circle, ending with that. Thank you again for being here. It was fantastic.
You're the man.
All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, and its affiliates, subsidiaries, employees, and agents, including Park Avenue Securities and the Guardian Network. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information participants consider reliable, and Dr. Crosby and Guardian are not responsible for the consequences of any decisions or actions taken because of the information provided. Guardian copyright is a registered trademark of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America. All materials are subject to United States copyright laws. Copyright 2020 Guardian 2020-94494, expiration 03-2022.